In the heart of a bustling zoo, a catastrophic event unfolded that no one could have ever predicted. It began with a loud, piercing scream, cutting through the usual sounds of animals and excited visitors. At first, I thought it was just a child who had lost their way, but the panic in the air soon proved otherwise. A fully grown lion, wild and unpredictable, was running free within the zoo. It wasn't just a run-of-the-mill escape. This lion was sprinting through the crowd, dodging panicked families and workers alike. As chaos erupted around me, I realized that this was no ordinary escape. Atlas, the lion, was not running toward the exit, where the terrified visitors had gathered, but toward the service area where the zoo's back gates had been left open. A chilling realization struck me. If Atlas reached the streets, the consequences could be disastrous. With my heart pounding, I chased after him, calling for help. As I sprinted through the zoo, I could hear sirens in the distance, but nothing could prepare me for what awaited outside. Atlas had reached the service gates and bolted into the streets. The scene was chaotic. Drivers slammed on their brakes, pedestrians scattered in all directions, and some even pulled out their phones to capture the unfolding nightmare. I was running just a few steps behind, urging the emergency teams to send tranquilizers as I raced to keep up with the beast. Then, just when I thought things couldn't get worse, I saw him. Atlas had stopped near a park, and in a bizarre twist of fate, he locked eyes with an elderly woman feeding pigeons. What happened next defied every expectation I had. The elderly woman sat there, calm and serene, seemingly oblivious to the chaos unfolding around her. I watched in horror as Atlas, the giant lion, approached her slowly. His massive paws barely made a sound on the grass, his eyes fixed intently on her. It was as if he were drawn to her presence, and I had no idea why. In the distance, I could hear the screams of people running from the park, but the woman remained still as if she were in another world. I screamed at her to run, to get to safety, but it was too late. She turned to face the lion, and instead of the scream I had expected, she spoke softly, almost as if in disbelief. "Atlas, is it really you?" My heart stopped. How could she possibly know his name? How could this woman recognize the lion, the very same one who had just caused such panic and chaos? To my amazement, the impossible happened. The enormous predator, the king of the jungle, stopped in his tracks. He didn't growl, didn't roar in anger. Instead, he lowered his massive head and gently placed it in the woman's lap. The lion, whose presence had sent the entire zoo into chaos, now lay there like a giant kitten, purring softly. The woman, tears streaming down her face, began to pet the lion's mane. I could hardly believe what I was seeing. The world around me had fallen silent, as if nature itself had paused in this surreal moment. The police, the zoo security, and the emergency teams arrived just then, but none of them moved. They were as frozen as I was, witnessing a connection so profound it defied all logic. As the police cautiously approached, their weapons drawn and aimed at the massive lion, I felt a surge of disbelief. The scene before me was utterly surreal. A full-grown, powerful lion, who moments ago had been tearing through the zoo in a panic, now lying calmly in the lap of a frail, elderly woman, purring like a domesticated cat. It was a sight that I never could have anticipated, a moment that seemed to stretch time itself. I looked at the emergency team, their faces filled with confusion and uncertainty. They were waiting for my signal, and I knew the weight of the moment was upon me. Every instinct told me that this could go horribly wrong if we moved too quickly, but at the same time I could feel that something was profoundly different here. The lion, Atlas, wasn't attacking. He wasn't even growling. He was at peace. The woman was comforting him, and the lion in turn seemed to have found a sense of security in her presence. It didn't make sense, yet everything about the situation felt impossibly right. I approached the elderly woman cautiously, my voice trembling as I asked, "Ma'am, do you know him?" Her eyes, red from tears but gentle, locked onto mine, and I felt the weight of her gaze. She was no longer frightened, and for the first time in what felt like forever, the lion was calm. "His name is Atlas," she said softly, almost reverently, as she ran her fingers through his thick mane. "He was just a baby when I found him." My mind was reeling. How could this be? How could this woman, a stranger to the zoo, have such a deep connection with the very lion who had just caused mayhem? The officer leading the team stepped forward hesitantly, his gaze moving between the woman and the lion. "What's going on here?" he asked, his voice uncertain. "Why is he so calm?" The woman smiled gently, wiping away her tears. "He remembers me. We have history together. He's not just any lion. He's mine, in a way." She paused, glancing down at Atlas, who remained still, his eyes half closed in contentment. "I saved him when he was just a cub, hurt and abandoned. And now it seems he's come back to find me." A ripple of shock ran through the officers, and they exchanged uncertain glances. The tranquilizer darts remained at the ready, but no one dared to move closer. I too was in shock, struggling to comprehend what I was hearing. "Do you mean to say that you raised him?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The woman nodded slowly. "Yes. 12 years ago, I worked at a wildlife rehabilitation center. We found him in a terrible state. His mother had been killed by poachers and he was left to die. But I couldn't let him go. I took him in, cared for him, nursed him back to health, and we formed a bond." My heart began to race as I listened to her story. It was unbelievable. How could a lion remember a human after all these years? And why was Atlas now seeking her out, risking everything to find her? It didn't make sense, and yet standing there with Atlas purring contentedly in her lap, I couldn't deny the profound connection they shared. It was a love story between a woman and a lion that no one could have imagined. "The zoo took him in when he was older," Margaret continued, her voice growing softer. "I had to let him go for his own good, but I never stopped thinking about him. I never stopped hoping that one day somehow I would see him again." Her voice cracked, and for a moment the lion seemed to sense her distress. He lifted his head, gazed at her with his amber eyes, and nuzzled her gently, almost as if offering comfort. I watched in stunned silence as Margaret spoke, the weight of her words sinking in. This was more than just an escape. This was a reunion between a woman and the lion she had saved, a bond that had withstood the test of time and distance. As the zoo staff and police officers stood by, uncertain of how to proceed, I knew one thing for certain. This story wasn't just about a lion breaking free. It was about something deeper, about the unexpected, sometimes inexplicable connections between humans and animals. And for better or worse, it was about to change everything for both Margaret and Atlas. The atmosphere was thick with tension as Margaret and Atlas remained locked in their silent bond, their presence defying the chaos that had erupted only moments before. The zoo staff stood frozen, their rifles lowered but still poised, unsure of what to do with a situation that was beyond anything they'd trained for. The lion, once a terrifying predator, was now acting as if he were nothing more than a loyal, loving pet to the woman who had cared for him as a cub. It felt like a dream, surreal and unbelievable, yet the air around us was charged with a strange kind of reverence. I stood a few paces away, processing what had just unfolded. I had seen lions before, wild creatures that commanded respect with their raw power, but this was something entirely different. Atlas wasn't just a lion. He was a creature with a history, with emotions, and a bond that transcended the boundaries of species. I could see it in his eyes, in the way he gazed at Margaret with such familiarity, such trust. It was clear Atlas remembered her, and he had found his way back to her, even after all these years. "Do you think we should bring him back to the zoo?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper as I turned to the head officer. He sighed, his eyes glued to the scene. "I don't know what to think. This is not how we're supposed to handle an escape, let alone this kind of reunion. But I don't want to risk anyone getting hurt." Margaret, who had been quiet for a while, now gently lifted her hand from Atlas' mane and stood slowly, her movements graceful despite her age. "I don't want to cause any more trouble," she said softly, her voice tremulous but strong. "But I need to be with him. He's my responsibility." Her words hit me like a wave. There was so much more to this situation than an accidental escape, more than the lion roaming free in the streets. Margaret had saved Atlas from death, and in return he had never forgotten her, even when years had passed and their paths had diverged. The bond they shared was deeper than I could ever understand, a testament to the unspoken connections that could exist between humans and animals, a bond that defied time and space. "Why didn't you come back sooner?" I asked, a thought I couldn't shake. The question had been on my mind since she started telling me about Atlas's past, but I hadn't dared to ask until now. Margaret hesitated, her eyes glistening as she looked down at Atlas, who was now standing beside her, his large body brushing against her gently, as if to reassure her. "I had to let him go," she said, her voice cracking, "but I never stopped thinking about him. When they took him to the zoo, I was heartbroken. I didn't want to intrude, and I thought, no, I knew that he was better off there. But when I came back and when I saw his face again—" She paused, wiping away a tear that had escaped down her cheek. "I was afraid to believe it was him." Atlas, sensing her distress, let out a soft growl, but it wasn't aggressive. It was as if he were responding to her sorrow, offering comfort in the only way he knew how. I could see the years of pain and love reflected in both of them, a shared history that spoke louder than words ever could. "But he found you," I said, more to myself than to her, as the enormity of what was happening sank in. "He came back for you." Margaret nodded, a slow, almost sad smile curling at her lips. "I guess he did." The police officers, after hearing our conversation, began to lower their weapons. Their once tensed postures now relaxed as they realized that no harm was going to come from the elderly woman and the lion. One of the officers, who had been silently watching, spoke up. Maybe it's time we let them be together." It was a simple suggestion, but it felt like the only thing that made sense. I turned to the other officers, who all seemed to share the same sentiment. Slowly they backed away, giving Margaret and Atlas the space they needed. I watched as Margaret led Atlas back toward the zoo entrance, a soft but steady pace. He walked beside her, his massive frame moving in sync with her every step. As they reached the gate, she turned back to me and gave me a look of gratitude, one that spoke volumes more than any words could. And then, just before they disappeared behind the gates, Margaret whispered something to Atlas. I strained to hear, and though her words were soft, they seemed to carry the weight of years of love. "I never forgot you, Atlas, and I never will." Atlas, ever so graceful, turned his head and met her gaze one last time before following her inside, his massive form disappearing from sight. The moment was both bittersweet and profound, and I stood there for a long time, unsure of how to feel. I had just witnessed something extraordinary. An animal, a lion, had found its way home, back to the woman who had saved its life so long ago. Days passed after the unforgettable reunion between Margaret and Atlas. The zoo, which had been thrown into chaos by the lion's escape, had slowly returned to its normal operations. But for me, something had changed. I couldn't shake the image of the elderly woman and the lion, their bond so strong, so pure, that it transcended anything I had ever witnessed in my years working at the zoo. The sight of Atlas walking calmly beside her, after years of separation, lingered in my mind. Margaret's visit to the zoo had become a regular occurrence. Every day, without fail, she arrived early in the morning, before the crowds, and spent time with Atlas. It was as if the bond between them had been renewed stronger than ever. Atlas, once an unpredictable, wild animal, now greeted Margaret like an old friend, waiting by the glass as she approached. The staff watched in awe as the lion, who had caused such panic just days earlier, became docile and affectionate in her presence. I couldn't help but wonder what had truly transpired in those quiet moments between Margaret and Atlas. What had happened during the years of separation? How had this elderly woman, who had devoted her life to animal rescue, found her way back to the lion she had once saved? One morning, I decided to visit Margaret at her home, hoping to learn more about the incredible bond she shared with Atlas. Her home, a modest cottage nestled on the outskirts of the city, was filled with photographs of animals: elephants, giraffes, lions, and more. It was clear that Margaret had lived a life dedicated to the welfare of animals, and there was a sense of quiet wisdom about her. As she greeted me at the door, I noticed the weariness in her eyes, a deep fatigue that seemed to come not just from age, but from years of giving so much of herself to others. She led me to a small sitting room where we sat by the window, and she began to share the story of her life with Atlas. I knew from the moment I saw him that he was special, Margaret began, her voice soft yet steady. "He wasn't like the other animals I had cared for. There was something in his eyes, something that told me he needed me. I didn't know how I was going to help him, but I couldn't just let him die." She paused, her eyes distant as she remembered the day she found Atlas. I could see the emotion in her face, the love and the pain of that moment. Atlas was just a baby when we found him. He was so small, so fragile. The poachers had killed his mother, and they had left him for dead. I couldn't bear to think of what would happen to him, so I took him in. I did everything I could to save him, but I was afraid that I wouldn't be enough. Her voice faltered slightly, but she quickly regained her composure. But Atlas was a fighter. He grew stronger every day, and as he grew, so did our bond. He followed me everywhere, like a shadow. I was his mother, and he was my baby. We spent 3 months together in that small center before the zoo took him in. It was the hardest thing I ever had to do, letting him go. But I knew it was the right thing. The zoo could give him the life I couldn't. I listened in silence, absorbing every word. I could sense the depth of Margaret's connection to Atlas and the weight of her sacrifice. She had done more than just save a lion's life. She had become his family. And despite the years of separation, Atlas had never forgotten her. "But why didn't you return sooner?" I asked, my curiosity growing. "Why wait so long to see him again?" Margaret smiled faintly. "I didn't want to disrupt his life. I knew he was happy at the zoo, and I didn't want to confuse him. But when I saw his name on that plaque, I couldn't stay away. Something told me that he needed me, just like he did when he was a cub. I had to see him again." Her voice trailed off, and I could see the sadness in her eyes. "But I never expected him to remember me. It's as if he knew exactly who I was. I think he came back because he missed me, just as I missed him." I sat back in my chair, overwhelmed by the emotion in Margaret's story. Atlas hadn't just come back because he had escaped the zoo. He had come back for her. Their bond had never truly been broken. It had just been waiting, dormant, until the time was right for them to be reunited. As I left Margaret's home that day, I couldn't help but reflect on the incredible power of love and memory. Atlas, the mighty lion, had found his way back to the woman who had saved him, and in doing so, he had reminded me of something I had long forgotten. The bonds we share with others, whether human or animal, can never truly be broken, no matter the distance or the years that pass. The next morning, as I walked past Atlas's enclosure, I saw him lying peacefully under the shade of a tree, his eyes half closed in contentment. Margaret was sitting nearby, reading a book, her presence a silent comfort to him. In that moment, I knew that Atlas had found his home again, not just in the zoo, but in the heart of the woman who had saved him all those years ago. It had been weeks since Margaret's reunion with Atlas, and yet the story of their bond still lingered in the air. It wasn't just a tale of a lion and an old woman. It was a reminder that the connections we forge, even with those we might not expect, can transcend time, distance, and even reason. As I watched Atlas and Margaret from a distance one morning, I couldn't help but feel a sense of peace. The lion, once a symbol of untamed power and raw aggression, now lay calmly beside the woman who had once nursed him back to life. He was no longer a creature driven by instinct and hunger, but a companion, a protector in his own way, who had returned home. And Margaret, though she had been through years of hardship and sacrifice, had found her own peace in knowing that Atlas had not forgotten her. The zoo, for all its grandeur and exotic animals, had become a place of quiet reflection for those who worked there. And for me, personally, it had become a place where I learned to appreciate the extraordinary in the ordinary, the power of memory, and the profound connections that can exist between humans and animals. Margaret and Atlas had reminded me of that truth in the most unexpected of ways. And as for Atlas, he continued to thrive in his sanctuary at the zoo, his life now marked by both the love of the woman who had once saved him and the admiration of those who had witnessed their reunion. It was a bond that no one could deny, a testament to the unspoken promises we make to those we care for, no matter their species. In the end, Margaret had shown us that love knows no bounds, no bars, no fences, no cages. It is, in its purest form, limitless. And that, I realized, is what makes a home. i.e.,